black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, and then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. All of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were African American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice, in safety, and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and for those of you who are new to the show, the Umoja Circle is an African-centered talk show in which I correct errors where errors are found, and I introduce facts where I find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. And I always try to use books that I read and do my research on in order to enhance the dialogue that I bring to you. I don't just go on assumptions. Even though I do use the internet for some research, I use the books that great scholars do their research on. For example, this book that I'm going to do this topic on right over here is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and it's a book, It's a 6-year research done by a social scientist, a very famous, if you've seen her on YouTube, her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy. And I want you to understand that she makes some pertinent points of why do we act the way we act as people of African descent. And not only that, the resilience of us as people of African descent after hundreds of years of trauma. Okay, not individual trauma in the sense, because people who have individual trauma deal with it differently. To use the example in one of the lectures that I've seen, because I also study the lectures of many great scholars, some here, like Dr. Joy, because I want to understand why we do what we do. And she has the answer in this book called Post-Traumatic. And you see it's similar to PTSD, all right? And she brings this point out. You can't have 246 years of trauma collectively, not as just individual. We talk about generational trauma from 1619 to 1865. That's 246 years of continuous enslavement and the trauma that goes in it. We talk about the rapes, the lynchings, the whippings, the selling of your family members. If you don't think that causes PTSD in our ancestors, and then you say you're free by the 13th Amendment, you're supposed to be given certain type of rights, and you're betrayed, from 1865 to 1877, you're trying to inculcate yourself into the society that said you're part of it now with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But then you have another 100 years of trauma, the Ku Klux Klan, the burning down of your towns, the Jim Crow laws, and all these things, and the betrayal of the Republican Party when they made a compromise with the South in order to get Rutherford B. Hayes into the presidential office. They took the troops that were protecting the newly freed blacks and left them to the ex-Confederates who formed the Ku Klux Klan, and the states like Mississippi and Georgia who went back to a lot of the laws that put them in some of the same social positions that they had prior in enslavement for another 100 years. That's why we had to have the civil rights movement in the 1960s, 100 years from the 1860s when we were supposedly free, and the trauma that went with that, the lynching, the sundown towns, the segregation law that tell us that we could not go anywhere, the way white America was given rights to oversee us. If you see all the Karens and the Kens that in today's on these video clips of asking us where we go, what we're doing here, why we're that was the W.E.B. Du Bois had a term from his 1935 book called Black Reconstruction, and I got a quote here that I always try to remember. Du Bois' most cited lines from this book, he said, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage, the wage of whiteness." In other words, you could have been a dirt poor farmer waiting at that bus stop with Rosa Parks when she was trying to get on that famous bus, okay, when she was arrested for not moving. But you had that wage of whiteness. In other words, that farmer had the privilege, didn't have the money, but had the white privilege to sit in the front of the bus without question. Because that's the wage of whiteness. She had to go to the back of the bus. She could have been making more money than that dirt poor farmer, but he had the wage of whiteness. And this is the great social psychologist W.E.B. Du Bois say that we're not addressing. This is what we call white privilege. There's another story that I read before I get into the book. I want to give you a background of why she did what she did in this book, in which this story was during the Civil War. There was a lot of embedded reporters from newspapers in the North and in the South. So there were newspaper reporters following the United States Army Corps when they fought in many of these great battles. And there was a battle in Tennessee. I don't know if it was Chattanooga or Memphis, but he went to where there were POWs, captured Confederate soldiers. Okay. They were thin, raggedy, wasn't fed. It was horrible being a Confederate soldier, but they were dedicated to the Southern cause. And he was curious, and he saw this one Confederate soldier, and he asked him, "Why are you fighting for enslavement? Why are you fighting for all the things that the United States government, and you're shooting against your own American flag under this Confederate flag? Why are you doing it?" And this person was definitely not a rich landowner, and like a lot of whites would say today, well, he didn't own slaves. But he said something that was very profound to that reporter. He said that if I and that Negro is equal, then who am I? Okay, that's the wage of whiteness. At least I was white. And I'm fighting to maintain my hierarchy over the blacks. This was said by a Confederate soldier who didn't own slaves, and many like him died on horrendous deaths or got captured in many of these horrific battles for 4 years of hell during the Civil War. But what kind of psychology produced that kind of behavior to fight for something when you were just as poor or just a little bit above the slave? It's that wage of whiteness. And until we address that, Dr. Joy is trying to say in this book right here, that it's trauma, okay? This book addressed black trauma. And that's the first thing I'm gonna want you to understand. That, the trauma I'm gonna be dealing with is gonna be about our people, the generational trauma. Why are we doing the way we're doing? But it's just not only black people that were traumatized. If you are slaveholders, and if you read any of the diaries and the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other, they were in constant fear. They were in constant trauma. Now, another thing that I learned from this book, that there's various different types of trauma. There's direct trauma, if you got raped or as a young lady, or there's something that's going on in your life that traumatized you, a gunshot wound, or right now we have a lot of individual soldiers dealing with PTSD, which is that's a play in this this thing because the same kind of symptoms happen to us as a group that we are dealing with individually as soldiers. And the direct trauma, if each individual deal with trauma differently. Trauma is an overwhelming thing that happened to us as human beings. Okay, we all could deal with a little bit of trauma, but when their trauma is so powerful, like you're in the middle of a battle or you're getting raped where you don't have any control, it overwhelms your whole system. And there could be deep psychological effects. Okay, that's what she wants you to understand. But there's also indirect trauma too that can cause a PTSD event. And she used the example of what happened in 9/11. Okay, people who were right there at the site when it happened, individually, people dealt with it very differently. Some people were totally traumatized by seeing people falling those many different stories, jumping out of those windows, or planes crashing, and they dealt with it, individually. Some had no long-lasting effects, okay, or they dealt with it. But there are some people who might have been watching it on TV, say in California, and they're still being treated for the trauma. They can't get on planes. They got anorexia. They're talking twice a month quietly to some psychologist or psychiatrist in a room, speaking quietly. So trauma is dealt with individually. But what she's dealing with was the constant trauma of enslavement for 246 years. From 1619 to 1865, 246 years of trauma. Was there any kind of psychological truth or reconciliation? Things said, well, we know what we did, we're sorry, how can we help you, to black Americans or black people at that time? No. Then you had another 100 years of trauma of Jim Crow segregation that we had to deal with. Okay, and there are certain survival techniques that people develop when they're dealing with a traumatic environment, enslavement, plantations, whipping, selling of your children, being experimented on, okay? This book right here, if you look at the silhouette of that person, you see a female, and look at her, the bulge at her inside, at bottom. That's a pregnant woman working a field. Now, this American Slave Code, this book is about, you know how they have in the South or in Kentucky these breeding farms for stud horses and stuff like that. Do you know they were doing that to our black women from Richmond South into Maryland Eastern Shore? The most profitable plantation wasn't the cotton plantation, wasn't the tobacco plantation. It was these, just like it's very lucrative to stud horses and impregnate the female horses to get the foals for display or the Kentucky Derby. It was done to us. Okay, you think any of these sisters could have said anything about just say no? All right, Sally Hemings of Jefferson fame was 14 years old. Okay, having babies. As soon as the woman reached menses, that means 13, 14, she was studded, and her baby, just like a mare in Kentucky, was used for property. These babies were called pups, and they were sold. Trauma. And that's just some of the kind of things that were done to people that look like me for hundreds of years, generation after generation after generation, without any kind of psychological healing to this very day. And when we talk about it, it brings up this cognitive dissonance about why we want to bring up that old stuff. We didn't have anything to do with that then, but you're reaping the benefits, and the trauma is still not only in us, but in you, white America. Okay, so let's go on to some of the images that I'm going to talk about. Okay, to open up this topic concerning generational trauma, which still has an impact on black Americans even today in the 21st century, like I said, is exposed by the 6 years of research found in this powerful book titled Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, or PTSS, written by the great social scientist, Dr. Joy DeGruy. Let's go on to the next. This is Sister Joy DeGruy, who wrote this powerful book, and it must be on your shelf. You got to understand that we got to deal, until we heal that generational trauma, what you're seeing the problem, why we separated, why we can't get along. Well, how can you deal with a traumatized person or group of people? But the fact is, not only that we are traumatized doesn't mean that we're having a problem, it means that we're resilient. We're not supposed to survive that kind of trauma. But here we are. And every February, we bring up the list of stuff that we've invented, the culture that we've created, and the music that we've created, this fashion that we've created, the literature that we've created, all during this traumatic period of time living in America. Let's go on. This is that book again, different cover, but the same book. I think I got that book too, but it's all marked up. Let's go on to the next. All right. Dr. Joy DeGruy's work on post-traumatic slave syndrome invite us to see patterns, not as personal failings as a people, like I was saying, not as each individual has their own way of dealing with trauma, but as the predictable legacy of sustained multi-generational trauma, so that we can ask the serious question, what's real healing and just must look like in our time? What real healing and just what it must look like in our time? How do we heal this? How do we fix this? Until we address it, okay, you can't fix a wound until you first admit that the wound is there. And as long as white America does not want to face this truth and the cognitive dissonance you hear on TV, why we got to bring up that black stuff? Why we got to go back then? Why? Those are all reaction to cognitive dissonance. And for those of you who don't know what cognitive dissonance is, the dissonance that you feel, that tension, that reaction to a truth that you have been believing in, the mythology of Washington and Jefferson, American exceptionalism that we are told constantly that this great thing, but then you have us who have a totally different memory, a totally different reality. It's like a brother and sister from a family, okay? And they're old now, in their 30s, say. And they get into a discussion about their just deceased father. And she admits to the brother, who has a different memory than she has, that she was molested as a child and continued to be molested as a child, and the brother has a totally different memory. That's white America, you know what I mean? That's the brother. Because his memory of that father, what he was told in his experience, white privilege, is that that's the man who taught him how to play baseball, took him to baseball games, took him fishing, showed him love. But her memory, her reality, her history in that same household called America is trauma. But how could you explain to a brother who can't understand that because his memory is totally different? That's the difference between white America and black America. Two different memories. And when we try to explain that, and since the dominant group controls all the avenues that would help or put laws or establish some kind of truth and reconciliation like it was done in South Africa after the apartheid was done, nothing like that was done for us as black people and white people in this country. And you're wondering why we're still dealing with this. And the same type of ideology and the same type of people who convinced that Confederate soldier that I talked about earlier, who said that he was the price of whiteness, that the wage of whiteness, that's the same thing that had all those people on lines to vote against their own interests in the last election in 2024. They were just as poor as that soldier. They didn't have any of the wealth of the people who were telling them that we're fighting for you. It's the same elites. The elites during the Confederacy, the elites today, billionaires, who are using that same wage of whiteness to convince people to vote against their own interests. It hasn't changed. And until you recognize this pattern, like she said, you will be doing the exact same thing that they did afterwards against your own interests. Instead of allying yourself with the same people, black people, you going against them and enhancing the riches of those who are in power, that are not in the same social economic class as you. And if you don't understand that post-traumatic slave syndrome is a serious condition, not only generationally for black people, but it's also generation for white America. And you see the results of this wage of whiteness in the last election and what happened on January 20th, 2025, when people started losing their jobs, their health care, and all these things, voted against their own interests because they saw themselves as white and different from people that look like you and me, okay? This is the problem. Until we address that sickness, we'll never truly be what this country is said to be, okay? All men are created equal. That's just a mythology. Until we understand the trauma that caused by enslavement, not only for black people, but definitely those who were in the group that would consider themselves white. So let's go on to the next slide. This will be a two-part show, and I'll continue into the next show. Dr. Joy DeGruy describes post-traumatic slave syndrome as a pattern of multi-generational trauma, like I said, and adaptive survival behavior. That's a key. When we were enslaved as a people, we had to adapt certain behaviors that were outside of what we would have done culturally if we did not have to deal with enslavement. There's certain behavioral patterns. If you saw in that book, in the video, and how that mother defined her black child, put him down in a way. That came out of enslavement. Then she ain't, like Dr. Joy said, she didn't love her child any less, but that child was up to get sold if he was smart. Because we were looked as property. That's the term chattel. I know people say it was slavery throughout humankind, but the thing that was established by Europeans, okay, no ifs and buts about it, by the church, no ifs and buts about it, it was an economic system that is attached to what we call capital, okay? Chattel will mean movable property, okay? And you made money off that movable property, just like I was talking about those horses in Kentucky compared to what was going on when they had those farms, those breeding farms that black women were continuously raped, and their products or their babies or products that they were looked at was sold. But you didn't hear that in history books. You heard the mythology, okay? And you were given this image from the time you were a child of the wage of whiteness, that somehow that made you better because, you dealt with from the Roman and Western history. That's all myth. This is the reality of America. Until we heal that cancer, we won't advance. We might even destroy ourselves as a culture. Let's go on to the next slide. This will be maybe the last thing. Slavery in what became the United States lasted roughly, like I said earlier, from the 1600s to 1865, followed almost immediately by Jim Crow law that legally reinforced segregation and discrimination until at least the mid-1960s and the Civil Rights Act that they're trying to dismantle as we speak today, without dealing with the issue that caused us to need the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and all the different types of civil rights laws that we had to deal with. You're still trying to deal with that issue today without addressing the core problem of the trauma that infect America as we speak. Well, I'm going to leave this right here, and then I'll pick this up on the next show. But understand this. History, of all our studies, history is best prepared to reward our research. That's what Malcolm meant. Okay, if you don't know the past, you won't be able to understand that which is happening, the present. It's all connected. Why we do the things we do as black people and why the MAGAs are doing what they're doing. It's a history behind that, okay? But I'll leave it there and leave it right here for now. So until the next show, peace, Hotep. Bye-bye.